Okay, well, thank you, Lori. I've moved into another room this morning because I was in the living room, and my son's bedroom is right above the living room, and he works as an RN at the emergency room in North Kansas City Hospital, and my voice carries. And so he let me know that he had to get up and turn on the fan to mute out my voice while he was trying to sleep. So I thought, well, maybe I better move. I've had issues with this before when I was teaching. Uh, fellow fellow colleagues didn't exactly like to be in the room next to me because my voice carries so much, but so I don't have any trouble being heard. And I also have a friend here, which is a border collie, which is my son's dog. She's only 2 years old and she wants to play all the time. So if you hear a squeaking going on in the background, that's what's going on, is the border collies wanting me to pull on a toy or something. The last week, I was kind of reassessing the slides we went over last week and thinking about the questions that I was receiving, during the question period of time. And I thought, okay, I want to go back and based on the questions and I was receiving, I added a new slide for further explanation or clarification. And I pulled the slide you're looking at now from another program on egalitarianism that's developed, which I'd be very happy to do that one with Spark as well. If there's anybody on the curriculum committee listening, hint, hint. But and right now, one of the problems with technology is I can't see body language. So I don't know how my teasing or comments are being taken at this point. But I am serious about be more than happy to offer that program as well.
Bill, this is Lori. You're doing just fine. Keep it up.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. So a couple of the questions was on the masculine, the feminine masculine energy source. And so I've gone ahead and from that other program, moved this slide over to this one, which kind of gets a clear definition. And one of the things that in the cultures, we're talking about the native cultures, there's a clear understanding of what these are. There's also a clear understanding that we all have both, no matter what your gender is, that we all have both, and we all have the capability of pulling on those. When I was growing up, I would receive subtle messages in my growing up years that I was to be masculine. And it caused me kind of almost subconsciously to ignore the other side of who I am. And as I got more involved with native cultures, it became obvious to me that that wasn't the case, and at least in the traditions, the ones who are traditional, that there was a general acceptance of both sides of our personalities and our characteristics and so on. And so I thought in developing the one on egalitarianism, it was very important to bring that out. So listed here are the qualities. Now, gender determines probably your base that you come from, but it doesn't mean that you can't also come from the other side. So deliberately on the left-hand side with the feminine energy, which is basically characterized by inclusivity, being very inclusive and relationship oriented. I put two pictures of males with their daughter, and obviously bringing out the loving, connecting side of their own personalities, and yet being male of gender. And then I put the third picture on that line is Deb Hayland. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's from the Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico, and was elected as into Congress along with Sharice Davids over here from Johnson County. So on the right-hand side, the masculine side of who we are, exclusivity is kind of the dominating characteristic. But I think the key things on both lists, if you look at the comparison, is the feminine side of who we are sees things and puts things into a context. It sees the forest and the big picture. It's the side of us who flies over the canopy of a forest. And therefore, it's the side of us who has the ideas and ideals and thinks in terms of our relationships. And it's also because of that broad picture is the wisdom side of who we are, and the generosity side of who we are, and sees these interacting relationships. So it's the masculine side that sees specificity. It goes down from the canopy into the trees and looks at more detail, and therefore becomes the analytical side, the practical action side of who we are. And among the Lakota people, whether you're a child, a male, or a female, there are four fundamental values, all of them in the old traditions were raised with. Two of them are feminine, two of them are masculine. Wisdom, generosity, whether you're a boy or a girl, you were raised to develop both qualities. The same with if you're a boy or girl, you were also raised to have fortitude and courage. And a couple of weeks from now, we'll get into that in more detail. But I just wanted, because of the questions that were asked last time, maybe to come in and give a little more detail of defined feminine energy and masculine energy. And when I was going through this again, moving the slide over, it triggered a memory of going up to the Rosebud Lakota Indian Reservation to sundances, which is a fundamental ceremony in the ancient traditional spirituality. And there's an individual of this particular Sundance, gone to it for a couple of years, the Hollow Horn Bear Sundance. And there was a Sundancer there who was LGBT, and his name is Lorenzo Blue Thunder. And kind of going over the slide, I just thinking of Lorenzo Blue Thunder as a Sundancer. And at night, you know, they would dance all day in different sequences and so on. But at night, we'd all be at their camps, and Lorenzo Blue Thunder would sing. And of course, they've gone, you know, into their area of seclusion too. But he would sing, and he had the most beautiful voice. And just to be able to lay out there at your camp after that ceremony, and then listen to the songs, and they were traditional Lakota songs, of course, but his voice was such that it was just kind of like a mixture of both sides of who we are. And it was just beautiful. You could just go back to camp and rest and just listen to that. Don't tell me how he had the energy to do that after dancing all day long, but he did. Another thing that was occurring to me is that I needed to make a stronger definition of what is meant by the axial age and the paradigm shift that was occurring. And thinking about that, the water, the river, and the tributaries flowing into the river of the earlier civilizations flowing into this one forest. And thinking about the analogy of the spear and the shaft of the spear and those qualifications, the dates of the axial age are 800 to 200 BC. Those are circa dates. And so we have a 600-year period of what we define as the axial. So the periods behind that is kind of the flowing influence that came out of that axial, and still has is still that kind of energy that developed then is still moving today. And I think that's what fascinated the German scholars so much. And so the axial, the list of qualities that are on that that spear shaft are the characteristics that came out of the axial age. And one of the things I didn't mention last week is that there's a thing that was happening that stands out in the axial age, and that was greater and greater urbanization. And you have people moving closer and closer together. And these three areas, China, India, Iran, and Greece, are kind of the outstanding examples. And India, Iran sometimes is accepted as the beginning point, although I don't think that's carved in stone either. But one of the things that seems to have started, had its earlier beginnings in that part of the world, and but also was beginning in these other parts of the world. And so we talked about Zarathustra. Let's focus on the center panel here first. We focused on Zarathustra and the coming of this concept of good versus evil coming out of the Iranian traditions. And then going down to the Vedic tradition. So when I was in India, one of the leaders of our group, and we were over there singing kirtan, going into elementary schools and singing kirtan in both Delhi and Rishikesh. And so we had to practice, this and so on. We had the leaders who would help us practice these songs and so on. But one of the people whose name was, I'm having a senior moment. But anyway, they were from, it'll come to me in a minute, Bangalore. I could remember Bangalore, but his name. From Bangalore, India. And I gave him a copy of the cyclical ramifications of the axial age, which Lori sent to you. I gave him a copy of that. One night we were sitting there talking about it. And it was just a fascinating conversation. And he talked about the Vedic tradition. And he said the Upanishads are a part of the Vedas, but they're kind of an ending part of our Vedic tradition. And he himself, being Hindu and raised in that Hindu tradition, he said the Vedas, the earlier Vedas around 1500 to 1000 BC, were really instructions about life, about our lives, and about how we relate. Also, more bringing in the natural world and our relationship with the natural world, and so on, and how to conduct, the moral issues and so on. But when we get to the Upanishads, in other words, when we get to the Axial Age, the Vedas became a religion. Before, they were not a religion. It was just a way of life, a lifestyle. But during the Upanishads, the Vedic tradition was becoming a religion called Hinduism. And I thought that was really a fascinating distinction and a quality of the Axial Age, which I thought was a very important one. But what's happening in this picture is part of the Bhagavad Gita, which is part of the Upanishad tradition. And what's happening here is really fascinating, because the ancients create metaphorical episodes. And so if you kind of shift from my mind is tries to concretize everything, but what they're doing is really creating a series of metaphors about life and the structure of life. And the key thing that is going on here, the person on the left is Ashoka. No, that's not right. I'm having another senior moment. That'll come to me as well, probably tomorrow morning. But anyway, he's in conflict with another part of the society. And he has an army that's lined up, and the other part of the society has an army lined up. And he's looking across at the other people in the opposing army, and he sees relatives. And he sees these relatives, and he's shaken. He's full of self-doubt. Now he doesn't know what to do. And he throws his weapons aside, and he cries out to Krishna. Krishna is like an avatar of Vishnu. And in the Hindu tradition, he would be the 8th avatar form of the god Vishnu. And so he cries out to Krishna. He says, "I can't do this. I throw my weapons aside, and I just can't do this." The problem with the opposing army is that in that story in the Bhagavad Gita, it represents greed and aggression. And the Pandava army, which is the one that is behind him, represents Dharma, represents that way of appropriate conduct in life, in a metaphorical sense. And I don't want to get too much into this, because the Hindu mind has a lot of depth and so on, but just to kind of make this come more alive and so on. So Krishna says to him that he's going to drive the chariot to lead the charge. Like Krishna himself will take over the chariot, but he needs to go forward, and he needs to obey the laws of Krishna, no matter what the cost. he needs to obey those laws of Krishna. And I'm not near as cogent in describing this as what it would be done in India and the Hindu tradition. But that kind of gives kind of the basic idea. And so that's the gist of the Bhagavad Gita. And here you see the picture of Krishna consulting with, which hasn't popping into my head yet. And you see a picture of Vishnu in the background, sort of guiding the avatar into this discussion. But the depth of this really is incredible when you consider our personal inner conflicts as a human being. When we know the right thing to do, but when self-doubt begins to enter and you begin to question yourself, and it begins to challenge us inside to grow in a spiritual sense, to continue that. So these ancient Hindu stories, like the Vedas and the final concluding piece of the Vedas, are very powerful. What's also interesting about that, these were not written down. You know, beginning about 1500 BC, all the way to 500 BC, 1,000 years of Vedic tradition, and then the Upanishads were not written down until a real rough copy of them were finally written down about 500 BC. And then were not really finalized until well into the into the AD period, which I think is really fascinating. So I just kind of looking at that picture and thinking about that. But here's something else that's fascinating to carry this on. The person who I can't recall the name immediately is the spiritual son of Indra. So there's an old story of Indra who's just recently become a deity. And because he's now a deity, he's being shown to his new home, which is this big palace. And so as they're approaching the palace, Indra looks at it and he says, well, it's kind of small, but it'll be all right. So he gets in there and he's living there for a little bit and he says, this isn't big enough for me. And so he gets a lot of construction workers together and they start expanding the palace. So it's bigger and bigger and bigger. And so then he's also in the throne room and he feels like the throne room is way too small and the throne is not near fancy enough for a god. So he gets the construction workers in there again and they start building this big throne and it's got to be out of gold, and now the room is huge. And they put a red carpet from the huge entryway, the doors, big double doors that close that entryway, a huge red carpet from there up to the throne, way down. You know, it's a long carpet by now because the room now is so huge. So one day, Indra's sitting in his big throne, and suddenly, as he looks way down the red carpet, he says he sees something black coming underneath the door, a huge black space that seems to be moving up the carpet towards him. And of course, he's looking at it shocked and somewhat afraid. And as it gets closer and closer, he sees that red big blob or black blob that's coming closer is thousands of ants, black ants. And he cries out to Krishna in fear. He says, what's going on, Krishna? What is this? And Krishna answers, former Indra's all. In other words, these are all Indras of the past. And that his head is, I think the message is, your head has gotten to be way too big. you need to get a little bit smaller here. Then going over to China, another fascinating story at this time period is the story of Lao Tzu and the Tao. And the same thing's happening in China that's happening in Greece and happening in India. You have this expanding urban population and an intensification of the population. And Lao Tzu likes his privacy. And he's the great teacher of the Tao. And once again, they don't know if Lao Tzu is a legendary figure for the mythology or if there's a real person by the name of Lao Tzu. But as the story goes, he's becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the closeness of the population and the urbanization. So he wants to leave. But as he gets to the gate of the city, the guards say, no, we can't afford to lose you. Your teachings are too valuable. And so they hold him there, and Lao Tzu finally agrees, if I write some of the teachings down, will you allow me to go? And so, of course, that was the agreement made. So he writes some of the teachings down, which are the teachings of the Tao, which we have today. And so then the guards release him so that he can go and, go out into more of solitude and so on. The thing about the story, too, is that Lao Tzu was reluctant to write anything down because he felt like in teachings, the personal contact, the interaction was important. And that once you write it down, it begins to create a sense of separation. And so he was very reluctant to write it down, which throws me over to Socrates. Socrates had exactly the same attitude, and he would refuse to write things down because he wanted to teach his students in person. And he saw writing as a nemesis. Writing was not a good thing because it depersonalized our relationships to each other. And Socrates was noted for his challenging questions that would cause his students to think. And I think that was really an interesting idea because what these great philosophers or thinkers are saying is that we do not want to institutionalize our teachings. But what we find happening, and it's on your spear, the shaft of your spear, one of the qualities of the axial age is an institutionalization which takes place. And so when you get these movements, these grand changes that begin to happen, it does create a dichotomy in the society. And you have, in this case, Socrates to say, no, I refuse to write. You see Lao Tzu, extremely reluctant to write because they don't want to depersonalize their teachings. And I think that's a very fascinating concept because I was raised to think writing and reading is advanced, and that's a big plus. But I was never taught to see the negative side of literacy. And I think these early thinkers are pointing this out very clearly, that look at both sides of the picture. It's not just the one-sided. Every time you put an innovation in, there's always two sides to the picture. And that brings me up to Pythagoras, which is more noted for his mathematics. But Pythagoras was also a philosopher and an artist and a poet. But one of the reasons I want to put Pythagoras in here is because he was also rebirth, many lifetimes out of the ancient Hindu. So there's a connection here. Is there a real connection that influenced Pythagoras coming out of India? Well, it's an interesting theory. I don't think there's any proof to that. But something's going on here when you consider the Persians tried to invade Greece twice, once in 490 BC under Darius. They were defeated at the Battle of Marathon. 10 years later, under Artaxerxes, they were once again defeated at the Battle of Salamis. But the Persians had taken over the Greek colonies on Asia Minor, but failed to take Greece on the European side. So I would just kind of want to kind of think about this interconnection, that there must be a reason why all of this is happening at the same time in this part of the world. Borders, the rising, growing influence of borders, country identity, greater and greater urbanization occurring, a separation from the natural world more. I think the Vedic tradition is really important there when you say the early Vedic period is more about human behavior, relationship, environmentally. The Upanishads become much more anthropocentric, much more about humans and their interrelationships. So, yeah, the tipping point, I think this slide right here is showing us a tipping point in human history, in human thought process, a shift in the paradigm, where this begins to propel us into where we are today. So I think it's a very significant slide. And I thought maybe I should backtrack a little bit based on really good questions I was getting last week and try to make this a little bit clearer and a little bit more significant. And because I did this, I'd kind of like to stop and see if there are any questions at this point or comments. So Lori, if we kind of open that up and before we move on further.
Absolutely. A reminder that you can unmute yourself if you have a question. Gil, I actually do have a question for you before we entertain anybody else. Did we have new handouts for this week?
No.
Okay. I just wanted to confirm that the handouts that you were talking about are the ones that I sent out prior to our first class.
Yes.
So there was nothing new for this week.
Right. And I'm thinking about one more handout for the 6 weeks, which is show a modification of the axial age, that point with the shaft and so on.
Perfect. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions?
Okay. Well, I hope that makes things a little bit more clear, and especially concerned about how we're defining masculine, feminine as an energy form and so on. So I hope that answers some of the questions about that as well. Okay.
Hey, Gil?
Yes.
I was fascinated to hear what you had to say about Lao Tzu and Socrates, both being very reluctant to write anything down because they were so concerned with the importance of the personal contact in their teachings. And I couldn't help but think what this has to say about our forced shift from personal contact, face-to-face contact in classes where the instructor is right there, and going online at one remove. And it's good to, I've been, this is better than, certainly better than nothing.
Yes.
Being online is certainly better than nothing, but I can't help but agree with Socrates and Lao Tzu that personal contact is a whole lot better.
Yes. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I like being in an actual classroom, and because what I noticed doing this, I'm glad we have it, and I'm glad Lori has the technology, the knowledge to do this, because it's safe for us to remain sheltered in place. And it's a good supplement. One thing I miss, though, over all these years of teaching, I got conditioned to observe body language.
Yeah.
And I could kind of respond to that. And when I saw somebody, like I could identify body language of uncertainty, that allowed me to clarify my definitions and, things like that in a classroom setting.
Yeah. I know.
And so I just got used to that. And I like the contact. But another thing about that is the cell phones and things like that. Like I go into a doctor's office, which I'm not going into recently, but there may be 11 of us sitting there. 10 of them are doing this thing over the screen of their cell phone, and I'm sitting there with my cell phone in the pocket observing, because I guess I'm old, and I'm not attached to the cell phone as much as some of the younger people are. So
I can weigh in a moment.
Sure.
Just, because as everybody thinks about, what the future looks like, and, there's this big exciting thing about, well, what's wrong with online classes? And I think we all agree, or many of us agree, that it will be very nice to get into a classroom for all those reasons. But I would also say, thinking about my life before the classes that I'm doing right now in Spark, and the last week, 10 days, I feel like I've had some interaction. I'm looking at faces, I'm hearing voices. Who knew that would be so important, talking to a screen? But it's better than, some of us who, you remember the first week or so, we just felt like, other than a phone and, maybe FaceTime with kids, there wasn't anything for us. So
Right.
I think this is a really nice in-between time. And, we are all hoping, and some of the universities are opening, some aren't. Some are saying our kids can be online, and I don't think so, quite honestly. Like you say, Gil, we need interaction in a classroom, and give and take, and body language and energy. Yeah. But this has been a really, to me, a very valuable option. Yes.
Well, I agree with you, Judy, that we can do this. We can still have our classes, and it's very important I think, for us to stay engaged. Yeah, even though now it's also good to be sheltered, but we can still be engaged. And so I think it's a very valuable thing that we can do that now. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Gil,
any other? Yeah.
Gil, if I throw in an extra thought, the move away from having the instruction in person started well before the collapse of our classrooms here. I mean, when I think back about my education, high school, college, a lot of it was book related.
Yeah.
That certainly did not have the benefit of a one-on-one or 1-on-30 relationship with an instructor.
Yeah.
And then also from there, why we've had videos and other things that in the more recent years. So maybe the Zoom class isn't the worst thing that's been happening
No, you're right. Yeah.
other than reading.
Yeah. I think that's where you get even all the way back to 500 BC, 600 BC, 400 BC. You have like Lao Tzu and Socrates saying, no, we don't want the writing. We don't want that separation. But you have other philosophers and so on, which are doing the writing. So you have that divergent, and that's one of the qualities of the axial age, is once you start getting this rapid change, you begin to get this kind of shifting of attitudes and things like that about different things. Any other comments or anything? Okay, well, we can keep on going. There. This is, you've already seen this, so I just put this up here to kind of refresh our memories we go through here. But you already have a copy of that basically. Yeah, axial age patterns and so on. And we already talked about Carroll Quigley and out of his one book, The Evolution of Civilization. And the other book I was trying to remember was called Tragedy and Hope. Last week I was having another one of my moments and I couldn't think of the name, but Tragedy and Hope is another one of his books are very good. One of the reasons I put these up here with the scholars, in case that might be one of your interests, you might be able to go up and look those books up. All of these people have written a lot more than one book, but I'm just putting up the book that I pulled a quote out of and so on. So we also talked about Attica and the makeup, the demographics of the population, and the fact that only about 30,000 out of 250 to 300,000 held office during the Socrates time period. We talked about the diversity of thought that's emerging here down with the growing urban populations and the disconnect from the environment, this dichotomy in thought, where the playwrights are trying to defend the position, the traditions, and then you have these other thinkers like Socrates and Aristotle and Pythagoras and so on, who are veering away from those traditions. And then we ended with discussing this a little bit, and on that axial page shaft, on the spear point and shaft, the qualities of borders, abstract ideologies, and masculine domination are emerging very clearly at this point in time. And talked a little bit about Draco. Very little has survived in written form about what Draco had done. But the three, Solon and Clisthenes Draco, are known as tyrants, not because that applies to our modern definition of a tyrant. All that means in ancient Greece is that they represent a movement from the norm. In other words, these were out of families that were not destined to inherit that power. Although they did come out of the aristocracy, but a lower level of aristocracy. But Draco is known for draconian laws. The only of his laws that survive are his laws on homicide. So nothing else of Draco survives, but later writers describe his laws of being extremely strict. Solon Another one of the tyrants, also from an aristocratic family, however, modified the laws. And again, not much of what he has survived. There's a lot of debate among scholars as to how much democratization really took place under Solon. But it's what appears to have happened is that he extended what in Greek, the ecclesia. The ecclesia are the sections, the parts of citizens who had voting and holding office power. And they could meet in the grand assemblies. So they had the ability to vote and hold office. And what Solon apparently did, and this is debated somewhat as well, but lowered the number of people who could become part of the ecclesia. So that meant that not all Athenian citizens could vote and hold office, even though they were pure-blooded. So then we get to Clisthenes, and there's more about him that's survived. And basically, what he's noted for is increasing the level of democracy. And of course, what we see going on here with the tyrants is a dichotomy developing within the aristocratic party, or within the aristocratic class, where you have the very upper aristocratic class, which were supposed to be inheriting these positions, but more and more the lower tiers of that class were coming into power. And that's kind of what we see during that time period. And then finally, Pericles, where Athens reaches her height during the Periclean time period. So this becomes very significant. What's interesting about Pericles is that he is very much dedicated to the concept of democracy. And so for the first time, Athens really is philosophically engaged in trying to develop a democratic form of government. But it also is a time when Athens is at her richest. This is when the Parthenon was built under his reign. And it was when the Acropolis was improved. And they got the money largely. Pericles drew money out of the treasury of the Delian League, which some of the other city-states complained about, but Pericles did it anyway to improve, put improvements into Athens. So it's kind of an interesting political sidelight here about Pericles taking money from the League's treasury to put into Athens and so on. But as Athens was prospering and becoming stronger, you have a major issue occurring with other city-states, mainly the Spartan League, which leads to the Peloponnesian War. Excuse me, which is a 27-year war. I want to skip over here. Excuse me. This Peloponnesian War was really motivated because Spartan was becoming concerned. And
Bill,
Sparta
can I
was
interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Judy Kirk asked when during this time was the trial of Socrates?
I'm going to come back to it here.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, but
Thank
it was
you.
in 399 BC when the trial actually happened.
Thank you.
Excuse me. So the Peloponnesian War was inspired because of Sparta's concern about the growing influence of the Athenian leagues, the Delian League. And Lacedaemon was the state that Sparta was in charge of. And some of you may be familiar with the word laconic. It comes from that word. And the story goes, the legend goes, is that there was an opposing army that had put Sparta under siege. And it had been months that Sparta had been under siege. And the general of the opposing army came up and hollered up past the walls of Sparta to the king of Sparta, or to the leader of Sparta, and said, "Are you ready to surrender?" And the opposing army that had put Sparta under siege, the leader of that army went into a long speech, went on and on and on. And he ended that lengthy speech with, "Are you ready to surrender?" And the leader of Sparta yelled back, "No." One word. That's where we get the word laconic, is from that no, that one word. So I just think that's an interesting little side bit there. But what's interesting also is that over on the right-hand side, you see blue dots lined up over there on Asia Minor, which is the Persian Empire. And the Persian kings had not forgotten about the two losses of their attempts to invade Greece. And so immediately they aligned themselves with Sparta. The Spartan army was well known to be maybe one of the world's great armies. And had they been free to, they probably could have beaten Athens. The problem with the Spartan army is that they had so many slaves that needed to be controlled, and the slaves were very rebellious, that their army, most of it had to stay home to make sure the helots, the slaves, would not rebel. And so here they are, tied down to their slaves, couldn't expand the way they wanted to because of the rough treatment of the slaves. And that's coming back to kick them. But fortunately, they can make an alliance with the Persians to help them out. And that's why the Persians are there. And mainly why Sparta won the war was because of the Persian alliances. So after the war, the Persians chose 30 oligarchs to rule Sparta. And here's where Socrates becomes, or Athens. Yeah, 30 oligarchs, I'm sorry, to rule Athens. This is an interesting issue because it tells you something about Athens. The 30 oligarchs were not Spartans. They were Athenians. The Spartans knew that Athens was so divided that they could pick 30 oligarchs from the Athenians to rule Athens. So in 404 BC, they put into place these oligarchs, ruled for somewhere between 8 to 9 months, and there was a rebellion in Athens and they were overthrown, and eventually they were all murdered because there was a lot of resentment, over the fact that they had backed the Spartan, and that kind of thing. They were murdered. So that kind of sets the context, the scene for the trial of Socrates. I still do not know how to pronounce his name anymore since going to Greece, since I was corrected. I learned to pronounce it Socrates, and I was corrected. It should be pronounced Socrates. So going to the trial of Socrates, 399 BC, he was charged with defying the gods and corrupting the morals of the youth. There were three men chosen to prosecute Socrates: Anytus, Miletus, and Lycon. And each of these three prosecutors had something they didn't like about Socrates. And one example is Anytus, whose son was in a relationship with Socrates, which homosexuality was not that unusual in Greece, but somehow this really rubbed Anytus wrong. And so he wanted to get back at Socrates. So the trial comes in, and there are 500 jurors, all Athenian citizens as defined by the earlier Clisthenes. So you had this a broad representation of the Athenian social classes here. And the Anytus, Miletus, and Lycon had, I believe, 3 hours to present their case. The trial lasted a total of approximately 8 hours totally. Socrates could come in and defend himself. But one of the people that Anytus and Miletus and Lycon brought up was one of Socrates' former students, Alcibiades. Alcibiades is a very interesting character. As a child, he was poorly disciplined. He had a definite mind of his own. He was a recalcitrant kind of a student and a recalcitrant person until he got in as a student of Socrates. He loved Socrates. He loved the questions. He loved the critical thinking that Socrates brought to him. But outside of his relationship to Socrates, he was a troublemaker. He was troublesome for his parents, and he was always kind of that way, outside the norm, always outside the box. In other words, he was a perfect citizen of a democratic society, at least in an idealistic way of thinking about democracy. But he was so out of tune with a lot of the traditions, he left Athens and oddly enough went over to Sparta, lived there for a while. Then he went back to Athens and then got tired of Athens and went over to Persia, lived with the Persians for a while. Kind of shows you something about how these countries and the sense of patriotism was not firmly embedded quite yet, in spite of the borders and things like that that you have. So this whole thing's an evolutionary process. But he finally comes back to Athens. Alcibiades is so brilliant, an expert in military strategy. He joins the military, the Navy, the Spartan or the Athenian Navy, and immediately becomes commander of a force and Navy. And when Athens was in battle with Sparta and the Persian alliances, Alcibiades' command got engaged with a huge Persian navy that destroyed the Athenian Navy. Well, the prosecutors brought this up and accused Socrates of corrupting Alcibiades and his belligerence, and as one of the reasons why Athens lost so severely to that navy. They also brought up other people, but I think Alcibiades is especially interesting as a way of proving that Socrates had corrupted the morals of the youth and had turned them against the traditional pantheon of gods. You know, it takes us back to here, where you have the Greek playwrights trying to defend the traditions, and Socrates and these other people define the traditional religions and so on. So you have Athens is not a solidly united city-state as far as the thought process. It's why we kind of look at the Axial Age as a paradigm in a thought process that began to grow during this 600-year time period. And these guys are great examples of that. And going back to India and going back to China and seeing how all that worked. So we begin to get to this concept of institutionalization. And Thucydides, one of the great historians of the time, was also a soldier in the Athenian army, but a writer. And of course, he believes in writing. Socrates does not believe in writing. But Thucydides, we still have a lot of Thucydides histories to this day. His history of the Peloponnesian War is just fascinating if you ever have a chance to look that up. Some legislators, this is a quote from Thucydides' writing, some legislators only wish to vengeance against a particular enemy. Others only look out for themselves. They devote their little time on the consideration of any public issues. They think that no harm will come from their neglect. They act as if it was always the business of somebody else to look after this or that. When this selfish notion is entertained by all, the commonwealth slowly begins to decay. And so what Thucydides has done here is define institutionalization. And we mentioned switching to writing instead of the oral traditions as a form of, perhaps that's beginning this process of institutionalization and so on. And institutionalization of societies and this dividing and how the traditional gods are solidified in here, and they're fighting this new ideas that are beginning to come out. Now we're going to leap from ancient Greece, from our shaft of the spear here. We're going to leap there to this slide. Institutionalization, as Carol Quigley talked about, we moved the pictures covering up my quote here. I want to review this again we talked about earlier. We have to move that up then. Okay, can somebody read that? I'm having trouble moving the picture off of all of it. Lori, can you read that?
Read the quote from Carol Quigley.
Yes,
A civilization's decline occurs when its instrument of expansion is transformed into an institution. That is, when social arrangements that meet real social needs are transformed into social institutions serving their own purposes regardless of real social needs.
Right, thank you. So we have institutionalization's original purpose becoming secondary to the power of the institution and its leaders. And this brings me to this issue we're faced with today, COVID-19 challenge. We have a clash today in our society because COVID-19 challenges human life versus our economy. And so we're experiencing that clash today. And this is really a clash between institutionalization and the original purpose of the institutions, which are designed to serve our needs, And we have a dichotomy that's occurred here. And it's affected our political status. Like we'll have the state of New York, which is saying we got to take care of the COVID-19 first, and we'll try to gradually open back up the economy. But we have other states that are saying, no, we need to get the economy rolling now, and let's open it up now. So we're having this versus, this oppositional thing that COVID-19 has kind of exposed an overall issue in the country itself. This isn't new when we start forming states. And over on the left-hand side, you see a statue of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. His name is Horemheb. He ends the 18th dynasty in ancient Egypt. We're talking about 1400 BC, somewhere in that circa date. What's interesting is that preceding him are the suspicious deaths of one, two, depending on who you're going to count as a pharaoh in the same family, the suspicious deaths of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, most of you probably have heard of Tutankhamun, who was a high priest of the god Amun-Ra, who became temporarily pharaoh after the death of Tutankhamun, who, by the way, Tutankhamun died at the age of 19. He only ruled for 4 years. And then you have Horemheb, the statue that's pictured over there. You see his statue there. He is the commander of the Egyptian army. And when Ai dies, he immediately seizes control and becomes the pharaoh of ancient Egypt. So what we have here is a series of very suspicious happenings for Horemheb to come to power. And then sweeping across the statement there, we have Caligula, who is part of the Julian-Claudian dynasty. And Caligula, very brutal. Many historians think he probably was insane, mentally certainly not stable. Claudius followed Caligula, who was murdered by his wife, who was Nero's mother. Well, because she wanted Nero to come to power, and then Nero has his mother killed because he became suspicious of her. If she would murder Claudius, Nero was a stepson of Claudius, she might murder me. So you have all this going on here. Then I skip up a lot of ages up to Adolf Hitler, the rise of the Nazi, and the death of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was established in Germany after World War I as a democracy. And then Hitler rises up and into that. Fascinating story about Mein Kampf and the rise of Adolf Hitler to absolute power. Then we move over to the Watergate. We move to current Chairman Xi of China, and oh, not another senior moment of China. No, I can't get it. Anyway, you probably know who I'm talking about, of North Korea. The rise of dictatorships. Is this a common pattern we're seeing happen from Kim Jong-un? It just came to me. Oh, by the way, if I may skip back to the India real quick, I just remembered the name of the man who went to war, and Krishna came to talk to him. His name's Arjuna. So I just thought I'd throw that in an hour later. Probably none of you are having these kinds of senior moments, but at least it gets into the frontal lobe eventually. But let's jump back to this slide again. So we begin to see of the axial age, do we see a pattern of qualities that emerge out of this once we get borders that are solidified, state identities, nation state identities, and high concentrations of urban populations. These all seem to parallel these qualities that emerge that are now in our worldwide. So I want to read this a little bit out of Carroll Quigley again. We now have a plutocratic system, and many politicians see it simply as a matter of buying elections. Here's why. As our economy is now structured, the big corporations, aerospace, oil, and so on, are able to pour out millions to support the candidates they favor. The restrictions on the books are easily evaded, and the politicians in power won't do much about it because they want some too. Carroll Quigley wrote that in 1972, or didn't write it. It's part of a speech he gave to a branch of the US military. So dropping back, and we're moving back and forth historically, because our threads here are about qualities of the axial age as opposed to a sequential time frame here. So abstract ideologies, part of the axial age on that shaft of the spear. Democracy disdain. This slide deals with intellectuals who didn't think democracy was workable or appropriate. Socrates, we've already talked about his objection to democratic forms of government. Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince, 1513 AD. At that point, Italy was under the reign of the Medici family in Florence. And Machiavelli wrote this book, The Prince, as kind of an instruction. And he's very clear that the prince should have absolute power over his subjects. But he also was pointing out in The Prince the human qualities that a prince must always be cautious about, because we're all human beings. And a prince wants to maintain his absolute authority. He must be on guard about certain weaknesses that are human. And he talks about how a prince can correct these weaknesses and not succumb to them. So it makes a very clear blueprint as to how to rule a country in an authoritarian state. And the Medici family loved it. And they elevated Machiavelli to high position in the Medici government structure. And when I was in Florence, we went to see the statue of David. And when we went into that museum, it was fascinating to see the statue of David. But if you went up to the statue and you made a left-hand turn, there was another room, a long room full of other statues. And one of Michelangelo's, he had some statues in there as well. But one of the statues was a statue of Machiavelli. And if you can see his face there, I swear that statue had kind of a smirky, kind of like grin on it. And I thought, when I looked at that statue, I thought, yes, he's playing the cards here to get his advancement into the military political system. But he had that kind of an impish grin on his face I thought was fascinating. And then we go over to Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan, 1651. And you see a picture of Thomas Hobbes there, but you also see a picture of Parliament. And the reason I put Parliament in there is because Thomas Hobbes disagreed that you should ever have a Parliament. He disagreed that you should ever have a representative kind of organization that would represent the people, because he said the people, you cannot trust the people. So he wrote a book titled Leviathan, which comes out of the tradition, the Christian tradition of Satan. Leviathan is a sea monster. And the metaphor is a sea monster is satanic in nature. And Thomas Hobbes felt like humans were more influenced by Satan than anything else, that they must be controlled by absolute authority. And so he disagreed with democracy as a form of government. So we have Parliament here because, of course, this book did not stop the growth of Parliament. The building, the Parliament building, I believe, was built a couple of hundred years after Thomas Hobbes' book came out, Leviathan. Let's see, 1780. Seems like the Parliament built, if anybody knows, you can kind of let me know. I'm not, I think it must have been in the mid 19th century somewhere where that building was built. But I'm not sure about that. I just know it was after his lifetime. But now we get an opposition to that statement with Lord Acton. I cannot accept your canon that we are to judge Pope and King unlike other men. With a favorable presumption that they do no wrong, there isn't this presumption. It is the other way against holders of power. Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so you have this dichotomy in the belief system coming out of abstract ideologies that is encouraged to develop by a state form of a national state form of socio-political systems. So to summarize, here's some of the qualities, a brief summary. And it doesn't seem to matter whether it's a democracy or monarchy or a dictatorship. State forms of socio-political organization tend to encourage the masculine side of who we are in positions of power. And the feminine side of us does not seem to have as strong a voice. Seems to be a tendency here. Nature is conquered rather than being in relationship to. There's a rise of exclusivity, national borders. Issues with racism, sexism, rigidity, and distance from decision makers and so on. Seems to be a quality that emerges. And I think at this point, it might be a good time for questions or discussion, if you would like to open that.
A reminder, you can unmute yourself if you have a question, or you can type it in the chat box like Judy did earlier, and I will ask it for you or unmute you so you can ask it. Never mind.
Yeah, if there are any reactions or questions, opinions, anything like that. I was really glad to get the questions about masculine and feminine last time because it allowed me to go back and re-examine what I'd covered earlier, and to try to make clarifications and so on. So I find things like that very helpful. I'm always in a constant modifying this program and maybe reshaping it a little bit.
Bill, Don put in the chat box that the Parliament building was originally built in 1004, destroyed in 1834, and rebuilt in 1870.
Oh, okay, so that was, yeah, I'm remembering that now. Right, it was, so what we were looking at was the rebuilt Parliament, right? Thanks, that jogs a memory here that I was forgetting about.
Hi, Gil. This is Carolyn Rao. I just have a comment. I think to have a truly democratic society, you have to have one that's informed. And I'm really concerned about how along so many other things, our educational system is being gutted and subserved. And it's just a real concern for me.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Your comments recalling, I think it was a freshman or sophomore in college, and one of the books I had to read was Democracy in Education by a professor at KU. I think it was Dr. Bailey. Bailey Hall at KU was named for him, I believe. But that book really summarized exactly what you just brought up. It was about a democracy to remain healthy must also have an educated population. And if the population is not well educated, it will put the democracy in trouble. And so at risk, yeah, I should say. So yeah, I appreciate that. You just triggered that memory from early college years. But that book, I think, was really significant in the way I'm thinking about the significance of education in a democratic society. And when Hitler seized control, one of the things he did was start a massive book burning throughout Germany. You know, thinking about the significance of an educated population. And any other comments?
Well,
Yes, I would. Oh, sorry,
who is that?
Wendy.
Go ahead, Wendy.
Okay. Going along with that would be informed consent. And it seems like now in America, a lot of the bad things that are happening are done covertly.
Yes.
And so like they're experimenting on people without informed consent, and they don't include it. Well, they don't tell people, so it's not in the news. It's not written into history. And then when they declassify it, it's so shocking. And for some reason, it still doesn't, the information still doesn't get out there to people, because having just read Poisoner in Chief and the other book, Operation Gladio, I mean, it's just really shocking, a lot of the things that our government has done that nobody seems to know about.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm thinking of a lot of examples of that with my interest in native cultures and what happens there that doesn't get out. And we'll deal in a couple of weeks a little bit more with that issue. So I'm going to save some of the comments about that until later. Yeah, the educational system and so on, right? And the news that doesn't get out, things that are done that we're not told about. You know, and a democracy cannot succeed without an informed public. And I think that's something that we need to really, as citizens of the country, we need to look at pretty seriously. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I have one. I would commenting, again, this is like today, right now, talking about COVID-19, and you pointed out that we've got this push-pull between the saving of human lives and the economy, and economy probably including a lot of things. But my thought was the dichotomy is that the economy supports human life. So if you let the economy go, people will die of other ways.
Right.
And isn't that the push-pull in this? Not that we, and I know there's some people who put the economy over human life, but others they say they're doing it to, in the end, save human lives. So.
Right. Yeah, your comments reminded me of a couple of things. One, going back to the Hindu Bhagavad Gita and Arjuna's conflict that he was having, you know, as to whether to attack the opposing army and things like that. The sense of self-doubt, but also there's a sense of, well, both of them are right. We need to do both.
Yeah.
And so how do we do that? And so we get this issue of maybe there's a sequence that there's an organized way to do both and not sacrifice one for the other.
Right.
And what I've come to see, and I'm looking at this, is the sequencing in COVID-19 would be the logical thing to do was test and trace, contact trace, then quarantine, and begin to reopen. As you're protecting the population from the spread of the disease, and then at that point, begin to reopen. And that's why you kind of think about the model that New York is presenting, is kind of, that's what they're trying to do it in that order, rather than jumping one step ahead of the other. I think that's, and that way you can kind of say, well, we need to deal with both.
Right.
If we do it in an organized sequential way, we can handle both of them if we do it in that way. So anyway, good comments too, Judy, and so on. Anything else? You know what? We've taken an hour and a half. I thought it was just 10 minutes. Boy, time flies. Because I'm doing so much of the talking, so it flies a little bit faster probably for me. So anything, yeah.
It always goes faster when the topic is interesting as well.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Well, if there are no more comments, I think I've used up all the time. Yeah, Bill?
You know, I build upon something you were saying. I find that too often we get ourselves trapped into thinking it's either A or it's B.
Right.
And what you're saying is that quite possibly there's a blend of A and B.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe at one moment A is bigger than the B, but then we move the other way.
Right.
Or sometimes we need to think about C. And it's often a mistake to say we have to pick one. So many things you look around and there are not single causes for
Right.
our issues. And if
Right.
that's the case, when we seize on a single solution, we ignore the other causes. And that's true for poverty and education and
You're right on, exactly
so
right.
many things.
Yeah, I totally agree that this is the case. I like to see that we're actually capable of dealing with both. Oh yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah. Any other?
Well, following up a bit on what Bill said and some of the earlier comments, I don't think for most people it's always a completely either or thing, like do we fight the coronavirus or do we save human life? I think I think all of the people who are anxious to open up the economy and get business going again would certainly not want to endanger their own lives, the lives of whoever is near and dear to them.
Right.
So I think it's usually more complicated than either or. In this, it's some lives say they work in my chicken, my pork, and my chicken industrial agriculture factory. Well, if a few of them die, that's not so important. But I'm not going to put my family and myself at risk.
But going back to that one, that may be a good example. For instance, there may be a very strong case for shutting everything down immediately in order to minimize the catastrophe. But there's a second thing that could be going on there. Instead of just being immobile for that period of time, we lay the groundwork so that we can reopen.
Right.
In the case of that meat packing plant,
Exactly.
maybe there are certain steps that need to be taken so that we can protect the employees. And once those things are in place, then we can go back. The virus is still there, but we've built up some protection.
Yeah. And if for a while there's not as much chicken or pork or beef around, well, as long as there are some alternative foods available. And in the meantime, when you take the steps that Bill has mentioned to make it safe to reopen, then you can reopen.
Yeah. So I'm saying a strategy to develop certain steps in a sequence, in a thoughtful, sequential way to kind of merge both, to do the C. My youngest son is, as I mentioned earlier, is an RN at the emergency room. And when he drives away every day, I'm concerned because I know what he's exposed to. And they're struggling with protective equipment for healthcare workers in these emergency situations because there's not enough N95s out there. And things like that to protect the healthcare workers. So they try to purify them the best way they can, because there's no other option because the supply lines are not feeding as many as they really need for protection.
Okay.
So anyway, what a great discussion. I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I've overstayed my welcome here by 5 minutes. So see you next week.
Gil.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.